What an incredible opportunity this is to talk about something that many of us have been discussing, I'm sure, over the last many months across dinner tables, across addas, across meetings with friends, looking at the various large movements, gatherings of people that have been taking place almost for a decade now, starting from Arab Springs, which apparently don't have leaders, which are not party led per se, which are very horizontal in structure and almost chaotic or anarchic in nature and character. And they've been coming one after the other, growing, burgeoning, and we felt that it would be exciting to look at what could be some of the salient features, or what could be some of the learnings, what could be some of the commonalities that we can find in these people's movements, mass movements. Now, why did we decide to call it unplugged? You know, obviously, this is a term that we've borrowed from the world of music. And in the world of music, unplugged essentially means where you unplug your musical instrument from the electrical amplifier, and what you hear after that is super plain acoustics. But in spirit, this word has also come to mean things that are more intimate, personal, engaging you in a very one-on-one direct way. It has a sense of handcrafted, full of imperfections, the analog world of things. So we felt that that's probably how we looked at these movements. And that's probably why we felt that the word unplugged would best describe what we wanted to talk about these movements. Aditya?
Yeah, I think actually the word unplugged also has, to me, some other resonances apart from what Arundhati has already described. And two things in particular, which I would like to sort of underline. One, which has to do with the fact that most of you have seen the film Matrix, and you know the plugging of into a world to which there's no outside, in a manner of speaking. And so it is a large system controlling every move of yours. Unplugging actually allows you the opportunity to go under the radar. It allows you the possibility of being outside the gaze of Big Brother. So in that sense, unplugging also is unplugging from the large systems of whatever. I mean, they may be systems of oppression, they may claim to be systems of emancipation, but eventually end up as systems of surveillance and oppression. So in that sense, unplugged or unplugging is a way of also liberating yourself from these large structures.
Yeah, and Aditya and we were thinking, how are we going to do this conversation? And we felt that I wanted to come into it more from a point of view of somebody who's been actively participating in some of these movements in Bangalore, the city I live and work in, with many of my friends, learning from them, experiencing from experiences of people who've been part of movements for such a long time. And Aditya has been both participating, practicing, but also studying and theorizing and writing about people's struggles and these movements for such a long time. And so that's how we felt we would come into this conversation. So I'd like to begin with one experience, and this is from Bilal Bagh, the anti-CAA movement that was the site that was happening in Bangalore. And going there every evening after work to sit with all of us together, all the women together, and talking to many of them, realized there were women like me, working women, but there were also homemakers, mothers of kids. There were women who worked in other people's homes, women who were small entrepreneurs. But there was one thing that struck me, that all of them that I spoke to, and we discussed many things and shared our anger, everybody remembered. They remembered the mob lynchings that were happening of Muslim youth. They remembered the demonetization and the struggles that common people had to undergo. They remembered how much hope there was before the 2019 elections, and how that hope was suddenly crushed post the election results coming out. And these were all like points of anger, almost saved up, and all that was coming out in this one final sort of finale kind of movement. And I wondered, is that how it happens for all movements? Do little things add up? Strains from different paths, strains from different experiences add up to create one large space where it all comes out at a certain tipping point. Aditya, what would you say?
Yeah, I think it's actually very interesting and important that Alok was referring a little while ago to Power and Contestation, in which we had discussed social movements in an earlier phase, which was citizens groups, citizens initiatives, small initiatives, and so on, on a range of issues. But what has happened after, in a way, the Arab Spring and then the Occupy Wall Street, various other, in fact, it starts earlier. In fact, it starts with the Velvet Revolution and so on, in Serbia, in Ukraine, and so on, and then comes into Egypt. We have the movement in Tunisia before that. Now, in the earlier phase, the criticism against social movements was precisely that these are single issue movements, that they are actually fixated on one particular issue and they have no larger vision. What we see now is an accumulation of contradictions, an accumulation of conflicts and discontents and so on, so that the tipping point may be one particular issue. It may be the issue of corruption in 2011, it may be the issue of farmers today, but it is not that alone which is actually leading to the explosion. The explosion happens as a consequence of this accumulation of conflicts, accumulation of discontents, accumulation of contradictions. And that, I think, is something which allows for the possibility of conversation across different concerns. So it is no longer the older kind of social movements where you had single issue concerns. Yeah, I would. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's what I have to say on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing. As you were talking, I was just thinking that not only are they brought together by an accumulation of these concerns and anger and dissatisfactions. Once they are out there, these platforms, and since they are not controlled by one singular idea so strongly and fixatedly, can become space for other conversations. They may not have come doing that. And I saw that in the farmer struggle, when there's this beautiful picture of all the farmers sitting there with the images of people who have been incarcerated recently for the Delhi riots, as well as for the Bhima Koregaon case, etc. That may not even have been something that they came with, but it's something that found space in the very site of this movement. And that allowing that space to be able to speak across concerns also I found very fascinating. And probably that's also a certain nature where it is not territorialized by one cause. It is not like only this will get discussed and this cannot be discussed because that wasn't part of the agenda. So that freedom of being able to talk about multiple things also makes it quite unique. But another common thing, and this is again a very personal experience that I have seen being part of some of these, from Not in My Name to My Street, My Protest, when we were protesting against the Kathua rape thing that happened. There's a deep sense of impatience, disillusionment, but also suspicion of traditional political parties. And okay, I won't say traditional, but essentially political parties. And somehow the very idea that political parties have a character of usurping certain moments of movements for their own agenda or for their own good, and therefore are only answerable to themselves and not really answerable to people at large, seems to be something that runs quite commonly across people who participate in these movements, to the effect that often mobilizers of these kind of coming together of people, and I've seen that in front of town hall, would tell a particular political party, please take your flags and banners away. You participate as individuals, you participate even as you're part of a party, but do not bring in your signs or symbols, because this space is not going to be dominated by a single kind of party. And that I find, again, quite fascinating, that there is a tendency to move away from what one understood as, when we were in college, Rajniti Kora, or doing politics, that you had to become part of a party, you had to go into a structure, a system, and only then you found a vehicle for your voice to be out there. But here there is a tendency to break that, to sort of take that center away, to kind of scatter it. And that I find is a fascinating energy in being able to do that.
Yes, actually, I would place the suspicion of political parties, and in fact, I would say much more. It's a sense of betrayal, because of which has happened repeatedly all through history. Movements have been spontaneous in the sense that they're not spontaneous in a literal sense, because there are always the local leaders and what Gramsci called the organic intellectuals. There's always long histories of experience which accumulate into the coming into being of a movement. So they're not in that sense spontaneous, but they're always non-party led, whether it was the uprising which led to the Bolshevik Revolution, or whether it was the great fear of the French Revolution, or whether it is our various mass movements during our own anti-colonial freedom struggle. Everywhere, and even later, the JP movement, for example, or Gujarat's Navnirman movement in 1974, all these movements are actually popular movements. But the history of the last 150 years, 200 years, the history of modern politics, which is inseparable from the institution of political party, has shown that these have been repeatedly appropriated by parties. And that sense was not so, that sense of betrayal was not so sharp till more recent times. But in a way, with the rise of neoliberalism, it became almost inevitable that there was only one kind of across left and right divide.
Yeah.
there was no difference between political platforms. More or less, all parties looked the same, they did the same, even if their names were the same, they were different, but they were doing the same things in economic terms and so on and so forth. So the movements which erupted against all these neoliberal measures were also movements against political parties. Remember, the first movement against neoliberalism following the worldwide victory of the neoliberal order was the Chiapas Zapatista movement, where even the leader, Subcommandant Marcos, would appear in a masked figure. You couldn't identify. He had to be faceless.
Yeah.
All his speeches, you cannot make out who is talking, what is he talking about. There is something, there is a very clear position against neoliberalism, but there is equally strong disavowal of the political party, the vanguard, and all these forms through which these movements have been hijacked over decades. This comes to a head, especially during the post-Arab Spring period. So there have been, since Chiapas, there have been many such. But I would say Arab Spring, in a sense, is an important marker. From then on, although then we see the Indignados movement in Spain and Greece and everywhere, where it was very clear political parties are simply not welcome. Even in some places, working class observing May Day demonstrations, but trade unions were not allowed. Trade unions meaning the bureaucracy of the trade unions, their leadership. So this is something which has to do with the way in which politics was hijacked. Democratic politics was hijacked by the neoliberal order. That's how I
Yeah, but I was also thinking that what you talk about appropriation of political parties and hijacking of these issues and people feeling betrayed is very true. But at the same time, what one also wonders is where does all of this work go to then? Because unless, and I've been thinking about that, one question that keeps coming back and I'm asking myself, so is the farmers movement, the struggle that's happening, this revolution that's taking place outside Delhi, is it going to make this government fall? And then the moment I ask this question, I have this huge blank canvas in front of me because I can't even understand how this is going to then become some sort of consolidated. How is the opposition going to use this? How is this going to come together as votes? Finally, it will have to be about votes against this government. How does all of this happen? Because at one end you have this suspicion, but at the same time you're also wondering how all this work that's come together by people are actually going to find a proper practical implementation. Right? So what happens there? And nevertheless, you do see leaders very organically emerge. So that's also something I wanted to say, that you see these leaders emerge at all these movements, and there are multiple leaders. And with this leader, I don't mean a single person, but spokespeople. The media can go to anyone and ask a question, and you will get a sense of what the movement is about, what the demands are about. One has seen that in movement after movement, that people are extremely articulate, extremely sensible about talking about their demands, what they're upset with, what they want to see, what they want from the government, all of that. But at the same time, when one looks at the political parties who are part of this or who come and join, they don't seem to have a strategic way forward with all of this. So there seems to be a huge, divide between what people want and how they are able to articulate, etc., and what political parties can make out of this.
Right. This is actually one of those classic situations which Gramsci talked about, where the old has become morbid and is decaying, but the new cannot yet emerge. Now, something new has emerged, but how that translates into a political formation or a political alternative is really the question. I would say now that the ball is in the court of the political parties. The people have responded, they have spoken on different occasions. The anti-CAA movement actually emerged because Parliament failed to respond to the law.
Yeah.
The law was enacted in 2 days straight with no opposition practically. The opposition only emerged on the streets. And once that happened, it spread almost in a viral form. And everywhere, it happened independently of political parties. Now, therefore, the question is, and I think that between the CAA, as you said in the beginning, so between the anti-CAA movement and the farmers' protest, it is not like there are two different entities. There is an accumulation of grievances, there's an accumulation of discontents, there is an accumulation of conflicts, which leads to these situations. Now, that is the fertile, explosive land, the ground on which the Mahagathbandhan in Bihar won the election. Political parties have to now respond. If they fail, if they do what they looks like they are going to be doing in Bengal, they will be failing the people. They will be actually going to hand over the situation where popular movements are actually showing you a direction, but parties, unless they respond, I can see some of them respond, especially some of the smaller ones. But even I would say between 2019 May and this election in Bihar, RJD too seemed to have responded better. Right? They have seemed to have shown some sense of movement from a position of intransigence to a position where they're prepared to talk. Now, this is where the test of the political parties will lie in the coming time. I think if they fail us in 2024, it will not be the people who have failed. It is once again going to be the political parties which will lead to disaster. And 24 will be the biggest disaster if we hand over power to this regime again. We'll make no mistake about that.
But tell me, just to plug in a question here, really, Aditya, and I was thinking of you talked about Bihar, and we are imagining what is going to happen in Bengal. And in both places, I mean, before the Bihar election, one had seen, I mean, the anti-CAA movement was happening, and it was at the height when, unfortunately, COVID hit, etc. But in many places, it continued, the conversations continued, etc. And then parties were able to use that to at least change the terms of the debate, that it did not remain a Hindu-Muslim debate in Bihar in many ways. It became about other things that it should be about. Why do you think in certain places it is possible for that conversation to happen by political parties, and in certain places it's not? Is it just to do with how parties think? So are there difference between parties and parties, or is one saying that it's anybody's guess what's going to happen?
I think that there something is changing on the ground. I think in a way where parties have also realized, and I would actually trace it back to the way in which the Aam Aadmi Party experience in Delhi actually forced the BJP to talk about education and health and so on and so forth. How much they tried to drag the electoral discourse into Hindu-Muslim and secular communal and so on, because that is their confirmed turf. They know once they can drag the battle onto that field, it will be divided into 80% versus 20%. And I think first in Delhi, then in Bihar, and now I think this is a sense which is growing. Many political parties are also now acknowledging or recognizing that you have to change the terms of discourse electorally. And that has already happened, especially now with the farmers movement, because the farmers movement actually places a whole series of economic issues. It's not just about the farmers. What the farmers movement is actually bringing into focus is the corporate takeover of our democracy, the destruction of our federalism, the destruction of livelihoods of common people, of all kinds of, not just farmers. So in that sense, the farmers movement is a point of over-determination, if I may use a very academic term, but where many different things merge into one explosive unity, and that explosion is where we are at, and that is where the possibility, and that is where in fact you see the ruling dispensation also on the back foot for that reason.
Actually, there's a very interesting question that has come right now, and I think it could be something. Do social movements get corrupted by political opposition parties? And I think there's the same betrayal, suspicion, impatience, disillusionment that we've been talking about is very much present in the question itself, the way the question is being framed. So what would you say? I mean,
yeah, I think it's not that the movements get corrupted, but earlier this is what the government has been trying to do with the farmers movement also. Find out 5 leaders whom they can buy, and the movement gets derailed. Now that used to be possible earlier, and which led to a lot of sense of betrayal accumulating over time. That whenever parties come in, they derail it, and they are
there is somehow
whatever
a samjhauta or a negotiation that happens outside of the people.
behind their backs.
Behind,
now this is not something which is possible now. So that's the frustration of the ruling dispensation also. But I wouldn't say that movements get corrupted. I would just say that they get derailed for the time being. And that is what has led to this new situation. But I want to also bring in something else here, which is more relevant to the global context, but perhaps important to briefly refer to in the context of the new contemporary movements, which is their post-national character. Now, when I talk of post-national, I'm referring to 2 things here. One is that there was a time when we believed everything, the horizon of our thinking was the nation and nation state. So whatever is good for the nation is good for its people. And so national GDP, national economy, this, that, etc., various things. Nehru would even tell the tribals or the inhabitants of Singrauli or Rihand at the time of the Rihand Dam, or at the time of other big dams, which are supposed to be the temples of modern India in Nehru's terminology, that if you have to suffer for the nation. It was an honor to suffer for the nation. But I think what has happened now is that no longer carries conviction. You have realized that actually the nation's good is only the corporate good, corporation's good. It is not the good of the people, and so
and
on.
also that the same people have been suffering and suffering and suffering for a very long time. Every time this happens, the same people suffer.
Yes.
Somebody else makes money on it, so yeah.
So for a long time, in fact, from the social movements, especially from the Adivasi social movements, the idea or the slogan "Hamara Gaon, Hamara Raj" or "Jal Jangal Zameen," these have been raised, challenging the sovereign. The old nationalist frame: nation is the sovereign owner of everything in its domain. The law or the idea of eminent domain was basically meant to say that the nation can, whenever it wants, dispossess you, displace you, etc., acquire your land for public purposes, and so on and so forth. But what a right or a claim to Jal Jangal Zameen does, what a claim to Hamara Gaon, Hamara Raj does, is to challenge the sovereignty of that nation. So in a sense, what we are doing is saying that, look, we don't trust this nation business anymore. It's not, doesn't make it anti-national, but it's definitely post-national. It's a different kind of way of imagining the future. But the thing is also tied to another thing, which is that it's also tied, and which is why I said in the global, it's as a kind of global question, that simply by doing this, you don't necessarily make a new beginning. You open out certain challenges for thought, for thinking. But if you want to challenge the nation state by simply recreating the nation state at smaller levels, then it doesn't really pose a challenge. So what I think this movement does is to say that the nation as an ethical emancipatory horizon is no longer working. But what is it that will work in its place? How do we need to think? Now, for example, if we just take one instance, I won't go into it for shortage of time. But if we take just one instance, which is the question of citizenship. Now, citizenship was an emancipatory idea that membership in a national political community will give you access to certain kinds of rights and entitlements. But what has the quest for citizenship led to in the last 100 years? In the last 120, 25 years, it has produced more stateless people, undocumented people, non-citizens, aliens throughout the world. It has created more tragedies. It has led to ethnic cleansing. It has led to identification of people who are non-citizens. So in a way, the dark shadow of citizenship is the production of the non-citizen, of the alien, the undocumented. And it is no longer that clear that this is, in fact, to me, it's quite clear that citizenship no longer is that emancipatory idea that we thought it was. Now, you need to therefore rethink this whole question. Mahmood Mamdani talks in the African context of not citizenship by birth, but citizenship tied to work. Wherever you are, you go in search of work. That is where citizenship now. These are things which are actually posing new questions for our thought, for thinking about the future, but posed by the contemporary in a crucial sense.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when you said post-national. I was also thinking that some of these, some of the movements have the potential to think beyond the borders of the nation, because the issues that they are really talking about connects to people not just within the political boundaries of one nation. So in fact, I was thinking that when the anti-CAA conversations are happening in this country, it's not just about the citizenship amendment bill here, but it must look at the whole idea of citizenship and what it means, exactly like how you said. So whether it's the Rohingya refugees and their plight, or it's the undocumented people and what Donald Trump was trying to do with them in America, or it is the, the case of immigrants who are in Germany and facing the sort of clash of civilization in some ways there. How do you deal with this question of people moving from one part of the world to another for various reasons? And therefore, what happens to the idea of citizenship, or who is a citizen? But what could also happen is also to push some of the boundaries of these movements to, probably while the movement itself deals with the immediacy of its impact in the here and now, it also leaves space for these conversations to happen around it, which are much larger conversations, and which are probably possibilities of imagining the kind of futures we might even want for ourselves, and not just within the, the borders of this nation. But I'm also keeping a little track on the time. There is a question here, and I think it might be interesting to ask, to look at this question now, and then we could move on to the next part of this conversation, which is, what has happened to the idea of ideology, once seen as the guiding light of both political parties and popular movements? And I think this question points to the fact that we have been talking about both popular movements, which are non-party led per se, as well as parties which both participate, appropriate, and at the same time are not really leading these movements. But where does ideology stand in all of this?
Right. No, that is where I think the question, I think, thanks for this question, Rajesh. But this is actually the point where all this discussion should perhaps come to at the end of it. Because what were ideologies? Ideologies were actually, I'm not talking of ideology in the abstract sense, although that is also at issue, because in a certain sense, ideologies are closed systems. They circle around what you already know. They never produce anything new in that sense. But more importantly, ideologies were always these top-down systems of representation. I wouldn't even say thought, because actually that if thought involves traversing the new, if thought involves always exploring the boundaries of the unknown, ideologies never perform that function. All the ideologies have ready-made fixed answers for everything. There is state, there is market, there is left, there is right, there is capital, there is labor, and so on and so forth. It may be socialism, it may be neoliberalism, it may be liberalism, but all these ideologies, eventually what they did was, these were vertical top-down systems embodied in top-down vertical apparatuses. What has happened with the emergence of the internet and possibilities of horizontal communication, that is what one of the things we indicate in the note to this program discussion today, is the horizontalism of the movements. Now, what happens with the emergence of the internet is that it's no longer a one-way broadcast. You're not broadcasting from All India Radio or Doordarshan or some in our current time, all these jokers in the television channels, but you're also not even looking at the big established media houses with their print newspapers and so on. Everybody is now able to talk to everybody else, provided you have that minimum access, right? So in that sense, conversations have become much more horizontal. There you can actually strain to any space and engage in a conversation. Of course, there is trolling. Of course, there is all that which happens, and there are ways of filtering all that. But what that enables, and what that has enabled, I think, is a breakdown of those huge 20th century ideological dichotomies. So if you are radical, you believe in state and socialism. If you are neoliberal, you believe in the market. Now, this is actually facile. These divisions were facile. The market functioning on its own was never pro-capitalist. It became markets, you can see them today. You leave the struggle to Ambani, Adani to fight with the peasants, you remove the government and you will see what the result is. It is the state which presents the facade of the market in a particular way. So the struggle is not between some abstract thing called the state versus the abstract thing called market. The state in its bureaucratic socialist form, or the state in its modern capitalist surveillance state form, are not fundamentally different insofar as individual freedoms of people are concerned. The freedom of speech and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the economic, let us say, so since we were talking in the context of the economic, there too, distinctions between state and market, the way they have been framed in terms of 20th century ideologies, I think no longer operate. What people are today looking at in these horizontalist movements, enabled through a certain explosion of horizontal communication, is a way of re-examining, reassessing different kinds of what one might call local economies. So you're not thinking of something called economy with a capital E, which is a nation state's economy. You're looking actually at local economies. You're looking at, in some places you call them solidarity economies. In some places you may think of cooperatives. In some other places you may think of some other forms in which small entrepreneurs, artisans, etc. function. So all these cannot be put in that frame of 20th century understanding, 19th and 20th century basically, where capitalism was destined to destroy all smaller social formations, social and economic formations. And then one day triumphantly socialism would come and replace capitalism. That's not what's going to happen. What is going to happen is this is the world. This world has to be seen much in the way in which queer theory abandoned the male-female heterosexual matrix. I think contemporary movements are also breaking down the state market binary by revealing a whole series of other forms like other sexualities. So it is in a way queering the pitch of ideology, so to speak.
Yeah, I think, just to add to that, Aditya, I think also what that enables in a very practical sense that I've seen on the ground is the possibility of the very amazing mix of unlikely allies, because it is no longer congealed in this term ideology. So for example, one of the questions that came up was how the farmers who are there, are they rich farmers or are they poor farmers? And initially there was this conflict that was trying to get created about, oh no, but these are only rich farmers, they are not the poor farmers, or what about the poor farmers? And that sort of died because one saw and experienced that there were all kinds of farmers who had come. It wasn't only the rich or only the poor. These farm laws that they were going to affect all of the farmer community who came together. Now, the idea, not only is the state market binary not working, the class binaries are also not working here in many ways. And very interestingly, what we saw at the anti-CAA movements in Bangalore, and it was surprising for me, was to see the large number of trans people, trans folk who had participated in the Bilal Bagh protest. Every day they would come, be part of it. And the first few days I wondered, because you associate certain things, because you've grown up thinking ideology in a particular congealed sort of way, you think, oh, but this is not a queer thing. So why are the trans people here? The fact that the Citizenship Amendment Act actually affects so many different people in so many ways and not just Muslims became part of the debate only when one saw these allies coming and participating in the movements and asked them, why are you here, etc., etc. There was a very wonderful series somebody had made on how the Citizenship Amendment Act would affect different kinds of people coming from different communities and different sexualities, etc., which was quite beautiful actually. It was a pack of cards that were created. So I think what the breaking of this and the querying of the pitch also does is it brings all kinds of people to be able to work together and participate in these movements together, and no longer restricting it to the black and white of ideologies, which was there in a slightly earlier times. But from here, I do want to move to a sheer simple idea of solidarity. Yeah. No, so Alok is saying that the trans people are also participating in protests and movements across causes out of sheer simple idea of solidarity,
right,
which is
right,
true,
right,
which is true. Solidarity is very much part of what people are engaging with, but also it is a new way of being allies. You are no longer saying that, oh, why are they here or why are we there? So it's a different way of forming these alliances that I think are working.
Can I just add a point, because you mentioned trans people, Arundhati, and I think Aditya, because I know that we're all been part of these conversations, but I think we saw this in a really radical way through an organization called Sangama in Bangalore, where Manohar Elaparthi, who was a trade union organizer, who led a trans queer people organization and organized trans people in a sort of a really kind of a traditions of the left. Right. And we started seeing trans people coming and supporting various social struggles because they said, we will make the first step. We will not ask why you're not coming to support us, but we will take the first step.
Right. But I think, Alok, the interesting thing is, I think that's probably what Arundhati is also pointing to, is that if you look at the 1990s, you wouldn't find, leave alone trans people, you wouldn't find gay, lesbian presence in left demonstrations, for example.
Absolutely.
Right. It was like completely impossible to think that a left demonstration would have visible presence of
Queer people.
Queer people, right. Now, today, leave alone left, in a place like Bilal Bagh or in a place like Shaheen Bagh, where there are a large proportion of Orthodox believing Muslims also, they have no difficulty in accepting that solidarity. So from one thing which you're talking about is the solidarity from on behalf of the trans people, which I agree with, but the reciprocation from the other side
Is also
is
there.
also something which is new in a way. I think more recent, if not
I think
altogether new.
there is a very strong growing sense of the common enemy, which I think is a good thing across different kinds of groups, and that happens as these movements take shape and conversations around the different strains that bring these movements together take shape. That happens quite practically on the ground in everyday conversations. I want to move to one thing that we had discussed and we felt we should talk about. Being in the arts, it's something that has fascinated me about some of these movements, and I want to show you a couple of slides on the amazing creative expressions that some of these movements have brought out. Let me just share this this slide. Yeah, can you see this? Can everybody see this, Alok? Is it visible to you?
Yeah, it's totally visible. Thanks.
Yeah, so this is I've just shared from three movements, a couple of pictures, images on walls, street art, etc., from the CAA, anti-CAA movement. Then there are these images from Arab Springs almost a decade ago. And then this one, I particularly like the one on my left, the Arab Woman Spring, which I thought was very, very critical in the context of Arab lands. And then these are some of the images that came out of the Hope Kolarov students uprising that happened in Kolkata. And what is interesting is, because there were probably, and that's my assessment, because there is no party line to give, because it is not official, there are no official mandatories, there is the freedom to express creatively as much in these movements. And one saw that, I mean, on the walls of Delhi and Bangalore and Bombay, there were stories and poems and songs and visual art everywhere. So that's a very unique characteristic, I think, of these movements, this energy of creativity, this energy that sort of allows it to be disseminated across various groups of people. So talking a little bit, recently Paramita Vora wrote a very nice her midday piece on how the farmer struggles have taken a whole new shape in terms of how they are being disseminated across weddings in Punjab. And after reading her article, I obviously went and searched for it, and I found wedding songs that berate the current government, which are being sung at weddings. I saw videos of couples and their families putting up a donation box saying, please do not give us gifts, just put your gift that you were supposed to give us here for the farmer struggle. We saw grooms arriving in a tractor saying, I want to send a message, and I'm standing by farmers all across Punjab and Haryana, which was quite stunning in the manner. So when traditional media is bought over and is not sort of reporting on any of this, people find unique, innovative ways to disseminate and mobilize the information around the struggle. So that's quite unique and common to all these movements, isn't it, Aditya?
Yeah. One thing I think would I would say has to do with the fact that there is no longer any I mean, it's an elemental surge of a movement where there is no longer one center from where it is guided. So obviously, from artistic expression to whether it's in the form of the paintings you showed, wall paintings you showed, or in the form of music and poetry and so on, like Amir Aziz's, it became like a sab yaad rakha jayega. You have these kind of things which become popular, catch on immediately, but there's nobody authorizing Amir Aziz to come and write. He just writes it, he takes a video, he circulates it, and suddenly becomes viral. That's one part. The other part, which I think is equally crucial in these movements, and I think that may be the point on which we can conclude and then go to questions if there are any. That is really the when entire societies are in movement, it really doesn't matter. So the kind of examples that you're giving about the weddings and wedding songs and coming in tractors and things, I would say, look at the role of the gurdwaras, look at the role of the mosques.
Yeah.
Look at the way in which, so we often only see one side of religion, which is the negative side, communalism, sectarian violence, and so on. But when masses of people when an entire society is in upheaval, the mosques and gurdwaras can only work in tandem with that spirit, which is their spirit of sacrifice, of service, of providing succor and support to the ordinary people. So when I went to Shingu border, actually I could see, and that was pretty early in the day, that already a lot of services there were being provided by the Gurdwara Prabandhak committees of various areas and so on. Food was being organized by langars and things, but also mosques. This is not just Gurdwaras. There were actually, there were Hindu people, religious people also there, but not as temples. There were individuals, individual Arya Samajis have been sometimes present. Swami Agniveshwani is alive, used to be. But institutionally, when an entire society is in a turmoil, the expressions are so diverse and so elemental, so to speak, that it doesn't really need the Godi media, for example, to propagate their what they have to say. It's being done from every Gurdwara, it's being done from every mosque, it's being done in marriages, it's being done wherever there are people there talking about it. What does it matter at that point whether a few television jokers are actually saying anything about it or not? So I think that is something which is quite characteristic of this particular phase of from the anti-CAA to the farmers movement. This is not something I will generalize to a global thing, but definitely our experience from the anti-CAA to the farmers movement, this is something which is important.
Yeah, and I think another thing that ties everything, and this I've been noticing across, whether it was the anti-CAA movement or the farmer struggle, is really the sharing of food. And again, I bring this up because whether it is through the gurdwaras or the mosques serving people food, bringing it together, sharing of food has been very key to keeping people together. So when one thinks of different ways of mobilizing people and bringing people together, the fact that there is a tradition of sharing food within our communities and sharing food with each other, whether it's Diwali or Eid, that you gift food to another person of another community and within your own community. I think that this formation, somehow I feel that these sites of movements actually become formations of these mini communities, which is as diverse, as energetic, as sharing and caring of each other. So like at Bilal Bagh, we saw that the moment people there realized that mothers were coming with kids, there was a little workshop area that some students just set up. Nobody told them to. And there was a little place where all the posters went up and the library came up where the kids could be left and the mothers could sit. Now, and then they realized that since people were going to be there 24 hours round the clock sometimes, you needed to feed people, and therefore the kitchens came up, etc. So it's almost like the formation of a new community with similar ingredients, but for a different reason, for a different cause, and maybe temporary in nature. But the strengths and the the glue that comes are very much similar to what traditional communities would be all about. Let me see if there are any more. So there's one more question, and I mean, we could probably request everybody to, if you would like to put on your videos and let us see who's been listening to all of us now. And I think thus also encourages you to, in these conversations, to actually, Alok, what, put up your hand and ask a question if you want to.
People can raise their hands. They can actually, often at this time, we actually ask people to sort of exactly what you said, kind of re-emerge from the curtains, and we can have a little conversation.
Yeah.
But not everybody is often in the mood to kind of switch on their cameras.
Yeah. Okay, so I already have a couple of questions. So the first one is role of women in these movements, and Reggie has asked this question. So I want to share a little story here. You know, this year, the beginning of this year in January 2020, I was in Beirut, and I was part of a cultural program where there were cultural organizations from all over the Arab lands which had come together in Beirut. Most of them were women, because most of these organizations are led and run by women. It was incredible. So I was sharing these images of Shaheen Bagh and Bilal Bagh and talking about how we were all being led by Muslim women into the anti-CAA protests, and how they had become inspiring role models for a country that for most of its time thinks of Muslim women as, you know, quite invisible, not having their own articulation or their own mind, and have relegated the space of the home and not the public space for them. There was a roar of laughter across the room, because all of them spoke about how in their own countries, it's been the same struggle. Being countries where communities, their own communities, have treated them in the same way. So I think that kind of explains role of women in these movements. Aditya, you would like to add something there?
No. I think I covered quite nice. One thing with respect to the anti-CAA and Shaheen Bagh thing is that the role of women was also critical in a way to the way in which the movement actually presented itself, and suddenly you had figures. So the conventional, traditional leaders of the community, who would have, I think, aroused a different kind of sentiment, popular sentiment, they were not so much in the foreground. They were, in fact, almost never in the foreground. But you had images of Ambedkar and Gandhi and this, that, and so on. Not what you traditionally associate with the Muslim community. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily thought through in advance. It is something which happened, I think, in the course of the movement, because the defense of the constitution became central. So Ambedkar and Gandhi also became central, and in a way that had to do with the fact that the movement sought to present itself not, despite huge Muslim presence, it was never a movement about Muslims only. It was always a much broader question in that sense.
Yeah, I don't see any. There is one more question I found. Yeah. Are students or the youth distracted by gadgets, or do you believe they will continue to lead or spark change? The gadgets, I think, are actually helping a lot of this. I think a lot of this wouldn't be possible without the WhatsApps and the Facebooks on our phones, and also a large part of the documentation of this going live from these spaces. I don't know, I'm sort of pro gadgets on this one. I don't know, Aditya, what you feel.
No, I think everything is in a way cuts both ways. You know, it has nothing is unambiguously good or bad.
True.
I mean, there are very dangerous negative aspects also of these gadgets. For me, surveillance is the biggest.
Mm.
Surveillance by government, surveillance by corporations, and so on and so forth. So I would prefer to be an Osama bin Laden who exchanges messages by pigeons rather than phones. You know the story, no? The Americans found it very difficult to track down bin Laden because they couldn't locate him. If he had a mobile phone, they would have located him. So, so I think it cuts both ways. Anyway, yeah, I think Ajit
Ajit has a question.
I have a question. Thank you very much. This is absolutely fast. I'm in the field of investments and stock markets. Very different world. But I just to give I won't go there. But about a year ago or so, an uncle of mine, actually, he's 94 years old, and he's seen a lot in life and studied economics, whatever. He gave me a 20-page booklet that he wrote to read about democracy or how it's failed. And I mean, reading what he wrote and then looking at my own experiences over the decades, I'm kind of more and more convinced that the reason we've got many of these problems is because decision-making is far removed from the people who get impacted. And if there was a way to bring decision-making down, if you think about it, that's what democracy, or that's what Mahatma Gandhi said, India lies in its villages, and you kind of have the district officers used by the British to rule India. But if you could have had better planning, and in the Aam Aadmi, when Arvind Kejriwal wrote Swaraj, he devoted 2 paragraphs to the Swiss experiment. I'm actually in Switzerland right now, coincidentally, but he devoted two short paragraphs to direct democracy and the rule of decision making and the voting power moving down, as opposed to you having 1 out of every, 1.5 million people get to elect someone, in a parliament in that ratio. And then it's the political parties that take over, and decision making is far removed from those who get impacted. So what about looking at a bigger picture and saying, how do we redefine democracy? Because if you do that, and if you get decision making down to a lower roots, maybe a lot of these problems that we're all firefighting will go away.
No, you're right. I mean, that the point is, and that's what I was saying, that actually what new forms can emerge is still an open question. The movements have sort of opened out a space. They have shown us also the inefficacy of, interestingly, after the Occupy Wall Street and Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street movements, Princeton University, some professors, scholars conducted a study and came to the conclusion that actually there aren't any existing democracies in the world. What we call democracies are actually oligarchies, electoral oligarchies. So it's just that, so I think first thing we have to do is to just stop calling them democracies. These are electoral representative systems through which one oligarchy functions, replaces another oligarchy, but they're all tied at the end of the day. It doesn't matter which oligarchy is in power, because the powerful remain behind the scenes remain the same. So what can be a new imagination of democracy? That is, I think, now clearly on the table, and most movements across the world, while they have attacked the political parties, they have not attacked democracy. They're actually not. They have directed their ire at the electoral representative system through which political parties hijack, call it popular will or desire or whatever. But democracy then has to think in terms of other institutional forms. I think that you cannot avoid the question of other institutions and institutional forms. Direct democracy is certainly important at the local levels, but the minute you go on a slightly higher scale, the question of representation will come up. The question will be of how to ensure. See, direct democracy can function in very large communities or large constituencies. So how does that work? Now, for that, you need to have something where I was seeing a meme by somebody on Facebook the other day, and I thought, yes, if this can be given an institutional form, which basically said that if I can't change my vote after casting it, how can the one who's elected on my vote change his
You.
after getting elected? I voted for a particular, so then do I have the right to change my vote and say, no, I withdraw my vote to you, right? There was a form of this demand which was articulated as the right to recall during the JP movement also and other. But I think some way in which new forms or institutional thinking have to be worked out, where you may not be able to entirely do away with representatives, but representatives will have to be under leash. They cannot function, they cannot take your vote and function for somebody else. Right?
There's one question from, Nasreen. Now, Nasreen has been one of the women at Bilal Bagh that all of us have learned tons from. She's been one of the leading forces of the Bilal Bagh movement in Bangalore. And Nasreen is asking this question that, how can we continue to fight for justice as activists? Because you hear that without political power, you can't really make that happen. So how I would like to continue to work as an activist, but how do I keep this fight ongoing? Because without actual political power, what happens to all the work that I'm putting in?
Yeah, I think it's partly tied to Alok's question, Ajit's question earlier.
Yeah.
This is, in a sense, I think the challenge is for us to be able to tell political parties when they come for elections that it's not about your manifesto. This is our manifesto, right? If you want our vote, this is what you have to do. So there have been attempts to frame people's manifestos, this, that, and so on and so forth. But usually those are also done by small groups of individuals, drawing, of course, from various experiences of social movements and so on. But at some level, I think this has to become a constituency level concern. At the constituency level, we have to have a more alert response of what we want and what are the kind of things we put on the table. So the election menu is not decided between, I don't have to choose between the menu served by party A, B, and C. But I can say, look, this is the menu I want. And let's talk about this. So these are, I think, and I'm sure we can think of ways in which, instead of seeing their face only 5 years later when the next round of election comes, we can actually call our representative and say, look, we are having a general meeting in our area. And people are dissatisfied with what you're doing, or they are satisfied with what you're doing. We have questions and you have to come and answer us.
But I also feel I would like to add something to that, and that's for Nasreen. And I was so excited when Cynthia Stephen, we had heard that she's going to stand for elections in Bangalore. I would actually, as a participant, as a citizen, want to vote for someone who I have stood next to in a protest like this one. So actually, I would say, in a very practical, everything you said is fine, Aditya, but also that many more people from these movements should actually become the representative I vote for.
Sure.
I don't want to vote for somebody I have seen once or not even that in 5 years. I want to vote for Nasreen. I want to vote for Cynthia Stephen, because one has a real sense of who they are, what they stand for, and the years of movement behind them. So the more such people come into actually, I feel come into actual politics, because otherwise it will continue to be this us and them, that we are demanding something from the them, of which we can ask for anything, but given the amount of money that actually plays out in our elections, how do you hold them responsible for anything beyond that vote, outside of that vote, unless it is someone who you can actually demand things out of? So, so Nasreen, that's for you.
So can I just make a comment again? You know, so the comment that you spoke about, Mr. Nigam, about having people meet the constituents more often, that was the focus of the book that I spoke about. I would love to send you a copy. It's just about 22 pages or 24 pages, but it's very powerful text in that as what
Sure, I'd love to. Yeah, if you can.
Thank you.
There's another question from Pooja this time. Should we not be asking whether these political systems and processes are actually fit for purpose? So I think she's asking a question about what's the future of the current processes and political systems. Are they fit for purpose? Can they work, or do they need to be reimagined?
Well, I think one thing, I mean, this is my personal opinion, but I think that we are seeing the end of the era of the political party. There is a fundamental contradiction between the political party and democracy. You vote for a party or you vote for a candidate. Now, when there is an issue, let us say there is an issue of the RA forests being trees cut in Bombay, all parties will take positions according to their party's directive. They're not interested in what their constituency, what the people in their constituency want. I mean, I come from Delhi, right? In Delhi, there are parties. The Congress and BJP for decades have done this. We live in a gas chamber during the winter, right? But never once has this issue, only recent times, and there again, despite all its weaknesses and all its problems with the Aam Aadmi Party, that a little bit of seriousness on this issue became only evident in the last few years. Otherwise, there is absolutely no way in which you can even get them. They want development, they want more and more of things which will add to our water and air pollution. And they care two hoots about the fact that people, now it is not just a question of, there are people who are aware of the impact of this and how it is generated and so on, but there are a large number of people who are suffering, who are not aware of how or why this is happening, why their air is polluted, why they are feeling choked, why there is so much of asthmatic, allergic asthma in the winter and so on. So at every level, the question ultimately is, who is your representative answerable to? Is he or she answerable to the needs of your community, which elects her, or is she answerable to the directive or the whip of the party? I think what has happened and which experience has shown, is that ultimately it is the party directive which works. So you're not really, if you want a democratic representation, the institution of the political party cannot coexist with it for long. So I think that what is happening all over the world in the emergence of these new movements is an indication that we are witnessing perhaps the last days of the party form. It may sound too strange at this point because they are the ones who call the shots still. But clearly the issues on the table now.
I think Sanjeev had his hand up. Sanjeev, would you like to ask a question? I can.
Actually, people's movements have generally been distrustful of democracy, and as a result, people's movement have stayed away from the electoral process, which is very central to democracy. So I would agree with what Aditya was saying, that political parties have failed. But the question is, what is the alternative to political parties? See, all movements, whether it's the farmers movement now or the anti-CA movement, Jai Prakash movement, the left movement in 50s and 60s in West Bengal, all these movements were led by a large number of organizations, students, youth. So how do we bring them together on a single platform? That is the alternative to political parties. Building up new kinds of platforms who would participate in the electoral process. By withdrawing ourselves from the electoral process, we are leaving the field open to
Absolutely.
So that is something which we have to urgently intervene. Say the farmers movement now, all these organizations, if they were to build a party, to build a platform, or during the Singur movement in West Bengal, Nandigram and Singur movement in West Bengal, particularly in Lalgड़ area in Midnapur, there was a huge, platform, anti-police atrocity committee. But what during elections, what they said, we are not going to allow the police to come in. We are not going to participate in the election. As a result, the movements are appropriated by parties, and people who lead the movements, people who participate in the movement after elections are, they are left on the sidelines. So we have to think of building platforms and participate in elections, however few votes we get initially.
Right. I would just say one thing on this, Sanjeev, which is that when I say the end of the party form or the passing of the party form, I don't mean to say that we can do away with some formal institution of some kind. And a platform or a coalition of different groups. So, for example, it may call itself a workers' party, but the workers' party in Brazil, for example, emerged how? There was an autonomous movement in the automobile factory units in Sao Paulo and so on. And there were the landless laborers movement and things, the MST. And basically the party came into existence from these movements bottom up, right? It wasn't like 10 people sat and then they sort of decided to build party units in different parts of Brazil. So when that happens, what happens is that the party structure itself takes the form of a coalition or platform of different groups. The people who were involved in these groups came from a variety of ideological persuasions, from liberation theologists to leftists, ex-leftists, lapsed leftists, and so on. So that is, I think, the important thing, because there was no prior ideological thing directed from one center and so on, but rather the emergence of a platform or a party from below, that it acquired a different kind of character. It is early days, it was one of the very early formations, but take another example, which is the tripartite alliance in South Africa after apartheid. So you have the African National Congress, you have the South African Communist Party, and you have COSATU, the Trade Union Federation. Now, the Trade Union Confederation is not represented through the Communist Party, nor is it represented through the African National Congress. They are autonomous wielders of power, sharers of power in the state structure, right? So the result is that whenever there is anything which a policy decision which goes against the interests of workers, COSATU is not bound to defend it, or different constituents of it are not bound to defend it simply because their party, if they have a disagreement on policy issues with the SSCP or the ANC, they can come out on the streets and fight. So this happened during Lula's time in Brazil also. So I think there is some way in which some kinds of beginnings are being made. I don't know how long it will take or whatever, but I agree with your fundamental point, which is that this is the way to go, and we cannot afford to take a boycottist stance in terms of elections and politics and so on, that it has to be, I mean, one has to address that.
I think we have a last question here, which is talking about the huge paid for IT cells of certain parties and the control over media, the buying out of media. Is it even possible for activism to and the surveillance? So is it even possible for activism to continue, over a longer period of time? How would you respond to that? I mean, I have a response, but I'll come in after you.
No, why don't you respond?
No, I'll respond after you.
Look, I don't have any, I mean, we can't obviously compete with them in terms of money, but we do compete with them. We can compete with them in terms of numbers, despite our not being organized under a single big organization and so on. And I think as long as we have some kind of freedom of the internet, which is very crucial to defend and protect in the coming time, this is a possibility which is there open before us. How long it will remain, and there are regimes like China's which have tried to completely curtail. In India also, periodically different parts of the country are completely out of internet. Kashmir, we've seen what happens. So that is a threat, but as long as we have some kind of possibility there, we have to keep trying. I think in numbers, we can counter what we don't have in money terms.
Yeah, I think there's a very interesting, exercise that one could do if one looks at how, in spite of having the worst kind of oppressive governments, whether you look at Arab Springs or you look at the Hong Kong uprising, how people's movements have always found very innovative ways of tackling this issue. And I think there is a case to be made and about solidarities with, starting from hackers to people who know how to deal with the underbelly of the internet, to how to, what are the different ways of staying off the matrix, off the radar, and the most traditional, conventional way of mobilizing, which is door-to-door, people-to-people, sort of word of mouth and passing it around. So I think that while there are, of course, huge amounts of money, the IT cell, etc., the fact that you still see some of this fact that you still see the Shaheen Bagh or the farmers' protest the way it is happening, is often using the same gadgets and technology in very different ways, and sometimes getting very innovative about using what was truly mass media earlier, even before technology and all of that got into our lives. So I think innovativeness will have to play a role in this.
True.
And we can probably learn some stuff from, I've been trying to figure out and reading up on what happened in Hong Kong and how they were able to, starting from using those laser beams to dismantle the cameras that were trying to grab images. How were they using technology against, very cheap technology that the students themselves were creating, against what the government was using. So it's also a war of technologies in many ways. Okay, so I think before we sort of end, Alok, you would like to come in and give a little bit of conclusion?
No, I think I would actually, I don't know, I'm just going to conclude the session. I think you should conclude the session.
I was just.
Any kind of concluding comment from either of you? Why not we just have one last comment from both of you? On just, maybe something positive, Aditya. All of us are really hoping at some level that 2021 is going to be also a politically better year for all of us. I know it's a tall claim, but I think why not take a hit at it?
No, I certainly think so. I mean, look, what had COVID not intervened, which COVID came as a kind of excuse for imposing a political emergency. It was actually nothing was done during COVID, which actually was about fighting the disease. It was all about putting your political opponents behind bars. And as long as it wasn't there on the horizon, they didn't know how to handle the Shaheen Bagh effect, so to speak. But once the farmers' movement erupted, I think they're back to that situation. In fact, now it is only escalating. I can only see it escalating. And what I'm hoping, because this is the last chance for people who are employed, let us say, in a large number of public enterprises which are on the verge of being sold, that for workers and trade unions also, it will be an imperative to join in with the farmers movement. So 2021, I certainly have much greater hopes that it will see perhaps the emergence of something even more exciting
and robust. Thank you so much.
and robust.
I just wanted to end with saying, last year when we were trying to mobilize more and more people, and many people participated in protests for the first time during the Not in My Name, during the anti-CAA movement. And with some of them, after the third day, they would say, but nothing is changing. I've come to the protests for 3 days at a stretch, and nothing has changed. And over the last 1 year, I've been coming to these protests, yet nothing seemed to change. Now, it is important, I think, to remember how long it takes to change things. And for that, one could just look at either the civil rights movement or the feminist movement, or any movement for that matter, which is trying to change something that is very inherent, very basic in and around us. It takes a long time. So I figured, like, there are 3 P's: patience, persistence, persuasion. And there is no other way. You just have to keep chipping at it. Yeah, just that.
So we have to keep at it in 2021. That's a
Yeah,
great
at it. And keep saying 2021, not yours, but ours.
2021, not yours. I love it. Yes, fantastic. So
There's
shall we
another
end
P
that?
called PESA.
So I think it's 9 o'clock and we'll just end with that. So thank you all for being a wonderful audience. Thank you, Aditya and Arundhati, for joining
Thanks
us for
a
a
lot.
wonderful
Thank you.
concluding session. And thank you for this really great sort of gleam of hope as we enter into a new year, a strong political hope. And I think you're right. There's so much for us to be proud of what we've achieved in terms of just being as more politically engaged with issues around us. And I think, I hope we take it forward. As Arundhati said, keep at it, guys. And a very warm and a wonderful New Year's to everyone from DUS.
Yes, to
Have
everybody
a
here.
great New Year.
Yes.
Stay safe. And as we say, keep your masks on and sanitize your hands.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Everyone. Thanks for listening in. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.